Welcome everyone to Innocracy 2021. We are extremely thankful and excited with a look on the participants list to see that plenty of you have attended Innocracy before and you came back, and to see that the word was spread and the conference is growing. Innocracy is always about democratic transformation. Last year, for example, we focused on the role of visions, of positive future images to challenge the status quo. This year, however, we decided to look upon that status quo and the need and the room for its improvements. This is why we titled this year's Innocracy, Democratizing Democracy. And my colleague Paul will share our thoughts on that with you.
Thank you, Paulina. And a warm welcome also from my side to Innocracy 2021. Our observation is that over the last years, a lot of energy has been put into fighting off anti-democratic forces. And for good reasons. The rise of authoritarianism within and outside of Western societies is putting our democracies under tremendous pressure. We are faced with the question of how we can defend our democracies against disinformation, against post-truth, against the erosion of the rule of law, and against authoritarian leaders and parties who slowly undermine our democracy. However, a sole mode of defense might lead us to only think about what democracy is and has been, and to lose sight of what it needs and should become in the future. That is why at Innocracy 2021, we want to change perspective. We want to move from liberal democracy as a state we must defend to democratization as a process we must develop. In this spirit, we can read the history of democracy as a history of inclusion and expansion. The labor movements of the 19th century, the suffragettes in the early 20th century, the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s, all have in common that they did not only push for their inclusion in democratic decision-making processes, but also, and maybe even more importantly, expanded the scope of what it is that is actually democratically governed. For example, the question of labor or the question of the private sphere. These milestones of democratic history remind us that it makes much more sense to think of democracy not only as a state we must defend, but also, and maybe even more importantly, to think of democracy as a process that we must collectively develop, to think of democracy as democratization. Over the next 2 days, we want to identify fields which are excluded or which are being removed from democratic control, and explore how democratizing them, how re-democratizing them might lead us towards a more just and more democratic future.
One of the books that inspired us around this conference is Democratic Regression by Armin Schäfer and Michael Zürn. Michael Zürn, Professor Michael Zürn, he is the director of the research unit Global Governance at the Zentrum Berlin, and he is also spokesperson of the excellent cluster Constatations of the Liberal Script at the Free University of Berlin. We are thankful and excited to know that Mr. Zürn will kick off this year's Innocracy with his keynote, followed by a debate between Jan-Werner Müller and Rahel Jaeggi. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, and thank you very much to all of you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to your conference with this video. I would have loved to join the debates either in person or online, but I'm sitting here in Los Angeles as fellow of the Thomas Mann House with 9 hours time difference. For this talk here, I'm sitting in the office of Thomas Mann, from where he gave his powerful speeches in defense of democracy during World War II. Please take this as an attempt to provide my contribution with some aura as a compensation for being not with you. The theme is, and the general observation is, that democracy is under siege. This is an observation that comes to some extent from the outside. Democracies seem to become an object of mockery instead of role model. Just think about the transition from Yeltsin to Putin, from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, from Cardoso to Bolsonaro. But it's not only the outside view, it's also in terms of introspection. We talk about the end of democracy, let democracies die, about democratic retrenchment and democratic regression, as Armin Schäfer and myself has labeled it in a recent book. Also, from an observer perspective, we see a decline in the quantity and the quality of democracies in the world from 2001 on. As we can see, this is no dramatic decline, but it is a decline that is easily visible, that is comparable to the decline that we saw in the 1930s, and that started clearly in the year 2001, a year in which we had within 4 weeks a sort of a double event that we only by hindsight realize how accidentally 2 moments came together. That is, of course, 9/11, but it is also that within 4 weeks, the chairman of Goldman Sachs used and labeled and coined the term BRICS, also in fall 2001. And from that moment on, we see this decline. When we think about the sources of this decline, we can point to 2 different developments. One is the new attractiveness of technocratic authoritarianism. Countries like regimes like China and Singapore are examples of that. They are not clearly plutocratic. We can identify a common good orientation. They fight against poverty. They show that they can get things done. And in that sense, it is not only an alternative to liberal democracy, it is also a successful one. And therefore, we can see this very strange double movement that on the one hand, China gets more authoritative and more authoritarian. And at the same time, China's influence over other countries increases. And that is one source. The other source is the rise of authoritarian populism. It's a new movement. And if we only look at the 8 most visible and most famous or infamous authoritarian populist leaders, I'm talking here about Bolsonaro in Brazil, about Modi in India, about Erdogan in Turkey, about Kaczynski in Poland, Orban in Hungary, Maduro in Venezuela, and of course, if you may, Russia and Putin, and then Donald Trump for 4 years as president in the United States. These are not only the famous 8 authoritarian populist leaders, they are also leaders of big countries. So together they rule almost over 1/3 of the world's population. And one can say that roughly 60% of the decline in democratic quality is due to the rise of authoritarian populism. But why is democracy in trouble? Why do we see this double movement? Here we can point out that we have a set of explanations. All of those explanations point to structural changes in society and in world society. One, and probably a very well-known one, is the power transformation perspective that points to a decline of US hegemony and the rise of competitors with different ideologies. But then there's a question, why actually move these actors like China away from a liberal world order that have benefited them most? And there's also the question, even if it is true that China does think some things good and is moving away from this liberal world order, why do we things so bad, comparatively speaking? The second perspective that is important is the economic insecurity perspective that emphasizes the distributive consequences of post-industrial transformation. This is especially an explanation for the rise of authoritarian populist parties. But here also questions arise. Why is it that people do not vote for leftist parties if they feel economically insecure? Why do they vote for the rich guys like Trump and Bolsonaro? Why is it that the most clear-cut winners of globalization, countries like Poland, Turkey, Hungary, that they moved so strongly towards authoritarian populism? And why, by the way, do we have also a significant share of an authoritarian populist party in Sweden, in spite of the fact that inequality is much lower there? The third structural explanation is very much connected with the name of Engelhardt. It is a cultural backlash perspective that emphasizes value changes indicated by terms like post-materialism, feminism, and multiculturalism, and that this this sharp shift in those values has produced a backlash, a conservative backlash. But again, critical questions arise. Why, again, Poland and Turkey, where we do not see a lot of post-materialism, but the strongest backlash? And why do those movements target the International Monetary Fund and World Trade Organization, in spite of the fact that those two organizations are certainly not the incarnations of post-materialism? So all of those structural transformation explanations are important. They provide important background conditions for the liberal problems of our days, for the problems of the liberal democracies of our days. But they have an odd absence of politics in their explanations. We need to move to the political sphere in order to understand the changes that are going on, and therefore we need to move to the whole issue of the democratic regression as a change of democracies that to some extent explains the rise of contestation of these democracies. And Armin Schäfer and myself, we talk in this respect in our book, The Democratic Regression, about a double alienation. It consists of two steps. A shift of the institutional landscape and its practices away from the democratic ideal. This is partially due to structural transformations, but it is the shift that is decisive. And the second step is then that against the background of these institutional changes, we see a growing skepticism and decline of trust in democratic institutions. Let's look at the first step. The first step is a change in the working of democratic parliaments. In the 1960s, already Schatzschneider talked about the upper class accent that the democratic parliaments obviously display. In 2020, we still see this upper class accent, but in addition to that, we see now a complete dominance of one group in terms of education and occupational status. And these are the people who present a more or less a political class that is seen as more or less homogeneous. We see this notion that there is a group that has the same educational level, that come from the same institutions in terms of socialization, and that display a common habitus. And this is also reflected then in a situation in which parliaments become less and less responsive. It is the educated people who determine the decisions of parliaments. The less educated people only get their preferences if they are the same than the ones that the educated people has. The same with occupational status. So we see a lack of responsiveness of parliaments to the people in the lower stratas of the society. So we have a change from an upper class accent to a situation in which upper class accent is accompanied by the notion of an educated, homogeneously educated parliament. But this is not all. In addition to that, we see a relative decline in the importance of those parliaments. We see the rise of non-majoritarian institutions that essentially disempower the majoritarian institutions like parliaments and parties. And this is the second element of this first step. Non-majoritarian institutions are Supreme Courts, central banks, regulatory agencies, but importantly also European and international institutions. And all of those non-majoritarian institutions decide on the basis of an epistemic mode. They started their rise in the 1980s and parallel to the decline in the trust of parliaments, we see the rise of those non-majoritarian institutions. Indeed, there's a very clear negative relationship between the rise of non-majoritarian institutions and the trust in parliaments. Whether the trust in parliaments has caused the rise of non-majoritarian institutions, or whether the rise of non-majoritarian institutions has decreased the trust in parliaments, is something that needs to be decided by further analysis, but all the data that is available points to the fact that it is the rise of non-majoritarian institutions that started as a response to a decline in trust of parliaments and then has accentuated this process. So what we see here as a second change within democracies is a disempowerment of those institutions, of the majoritarian institutions, which represent the whole idea of democracy as put forward by Churchill at a certain point, that democracy is the small man in the small cabin. This vote given in the small cabin loses in importance because non-majoritarian institutions, which are not accountable to the voters, have gained in importance. And that leads to a situation of a growing dissatisfaction of at least a certain strata of the people, of the more authoritarian part of the new cleavage, or the more communitarian part of the new cleavage. And we can see it very clearly that if we take the average of 22 countries, that the skepticism about democracy measured either by negative values, either to the question people can influence politics, which is on the left side, or on the right side, that people do not feel that they have a say in politics, that this is a very strong correlation with the vote, with the election of authoritarian populist parties, and it also goes along the occupational status and the education status. So there is a sort of a political element in the change in the vote of authoritarian populist parties. Of course, we should not forget that the crises of the 21st century also played an important role. The commonality of the financial crisis, of the migration issue in 2015 and the corona crisis always ostensibly was that it is an hour of the executive. But in reality, it is not only an hour of the executive, it is also an hour of expertise and the European and international institutions. In all of those cases, it was either expertise or European and international institutions which played the decisive role. In that sense, maybe the names that we will remember regarding those three crises in 20 years ago are Jaeggi and Trosten. And in that sense, it's experts and not necessarily parliaments that made the decisions. The crisis led not only to some extent, especially regarding the financial crisis and migration, to unpopular politics, it also created the perception on those sides who were dissatisfied with this policy that they are locked in and not influenceable for this group of the people. So what follows from all that? I think, first of all, a sort of an analytical point. We need to bring politics back in order to understand the problems of liberal democracy in our times. We need to combine the structural explanations with a political variable, with the changes that took place within democracies. The second implication is that democracy should not be restricted any further or made more defensible against those enemies of democracy, because that ultimately lead to its abolition, because that ultimately strengthens the cause for the rise of authoritarian populists who appeal to people who feel excluded. We need to make a change that gives more of a feeling of inclusion. So, in that sense, defending democracy requires more democracy. This is a huge task. There is a double challenge that we talk about and that I mentioned in the beginning, the rise of China and the rise of authoritarian populism. Some people may see this as a catch-22. While the Chinese challenge requires more effective political decisions, the challenge of authoritarian populists seem to require more legitimacy as a response. But this juxtaposition of effectiveness and legitimacy may be a false one. I want to end on an optimistic note by saying what happened after World War II maybe can be repeated. It needs to be repeated. It is the existence of a substantial external threat in the period after World War II, the socialist threat, that may push democracies to reform and modernize. And again, these reforms and modernization is needed in order to respond to the challenge that increasingly people are alienated from democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Michael Zürn, to LA, and greetings to LA for this very dense keynote that will give us a lot to talk about, I'm sure, in the next 60 to 70 minutes. I'm now very, very excited to welcome our two panelists to the debate, to welcome Professor Jan-Werner Müller and Professor Rahel Jaeggi. I probably couldn't think of two better people to discuss this topic with. Rahel Jaeggi, I would like to introduce you first. Rahel Jaeggi is a professor of practical philosophy, philosophy of law, and social philosophy at Humboldt University in Berlin, where she also leads the Center for Humanities and Social Change. She has written extensively on the relation of democracy and capitalism. She will very soon bring out a book on progress and regression, which I'm dying to read, so I'm very much looking forward to that. And with us today is also Professor Jan-Werner Müller, who is Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He has written extensively on the subject of populism, but also on how we can develop our democracies further, among others in his book, Democracy Rules. Welcome to Innocracy 2021. I would like to start our debate with the analysis that Professor Michael Zürn has just given us, because I think he has provided us with two very interesting starting points. As you know, in this debate, we would like to talk about how we can democratize democracy, how we can further develop it. But to do that, it is also very important to understand the pathologies of current democracies. And Professor Zürn pointed out two of those pathologies. Firstly, he talked about the representation gap in parliaments, the fact that especially people with lower education from lower socio-economic strata and their positions are less represented in parliaments. And secondly, that parliaments have seen a relative decline in power compared to technocratic institutions, non-majoritarian institutions like central banks and international institutions. My first question to the both of you, and I would like to invite Jan-Werner Müller to start, is whether or not you agree with this analysis of these two pathologies that Michael Zürn sees currently.
Yeah, thank you. So if I may, I'll start with two very pedantic observations. The first one is about the manner in which many of us tend to talk about one country that Michael Zürn mentioned at the beginning, namely China. We don't think would ever say in the 1950s, the Adenauer regime lifted millions of people out of poverty. And yet we always say, you know, Beijing fights poverty, lifts people out of poverty, and so on. I know he didn't mean to legitimate them in any particular way, but I think it's maybe part of it, of a larger tendency, and that might also play a role for your conference, of what our Hungarian colleague Peter Kreko has called authoritarian inflation. So yes, the threats are real, but we often also have a tendency to give some of these regimes more credit than they deserve. Both credit in terms of what they've accomplished, but also sometimes credit in terms of what they can do globally, in terms of interfering in other countries, swinging European elections, and so on. So just as a footnote about sort of the manner in which we sometimes now describe the threats to democracy. Second observation, and this finally gets to your question. So I agree with a lot of what Michael has said. I agree with the point that we need to bring politics back in. There's been a tendency to kind of reduce certain developments to sort of pure policy challenges, be it economic or, as the euphemism goes, cultural, which of course, sometimes means something quite different, as if all these things sort of existed objectively or in isolation out there, as opposed to always having a political context. I completely agree with his basic point. On the other issue, namely the more sort of specific diagnoses, I think, again, at the risk of sounding pedantic, it's important to separate a normative point from a quasi-empirical point. Normatively, I think there's a lot to be said for the argument that non-majoritarian institutions have become too powerful. I think that's, something you can very reasonably say, and we can maybe later talk about what can be done about that. The empirical point, which of course was very strongly suggested by all the countries he mentioned, from India to Hungary, etc., that I think is much more problematic. I don't think this is really the global explanation for the rise of authoritarian populism. I just don't see that in 2010 people in Hungary voted for Orban because they felt that non-majoritarian institutions had too much power. I don't think that people voted for Modi because they felt majorities were being disempowered. It's much more, and again, I know this is going to sound very pedantic, it's much more local explanations. It's sometimes because in a two-party system, the other side has been discredited. It's sometimes because, someone like Modi promises a certain kind of economic development without really saying upfront that he's a complete neoliberal who will actually only truly work for the upper class. But I think if we give voters a certain credit for understanding development, so if we, for instance, say, look, they know that parliaments are now full of people who are highly educated and are homogeneous in a certain way, which empirically is true, but I'm not sure everybody sort of thinks of parliaments necessarily this way. But if we say that, voters are able to understand that, and that influences their decision, then we have to be consistent and also give them credit for actually knowing that Orban, Modi, etc., or Trump for that matter, in no way have a real program of disempowering non-majoritarian institutions. They just don't do that. I mean, Trump might actually be a sort of exception here, but all the other figures who were mentioned are not in that category. Nobody in the AfD says, we should sort of disempower the Bundesbank or anything of that sort. So in other words, the somewhat pedantic objection is to not overplay this as a global empirical explanation and be more careful about restricting ourselves maybe sometimes to a normative critique that can be independently grounded, and be more nuanced about some of the country-specific explanations for the rise of certain actors.
Thank you very much, Professor Müller. I think this is very much in line what we want to do today, namely not so much focus on trying to find explanations for the rise of populism and authoritarianism, but also think about whether or not the pathologies that Michael Zürn pointed to, again, the underrepresentativeness of parliaments and their relative power decline, are problems per se and beyond the question of whether they lead to the rise of populism and authoritarianism, because they lead to a democratic deficit and not allow citizens to assert control over their lives and their common future. And with that, Rahel Jaeggi, I would like to invite you to share your perspective on this analysis of Michael Zürn and to what extent you think that he has pointed out two of the major pathologies of our current liberal democracies.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. Yes, I should start with some remarks upon the project as a whole, the project of or the book on democratic regression. What I very much like about the book, and what I also very much like about your conference, actually, I mean, even the title "Democratizing Democracy" indicates that in order to defend liberal democracy, we have to go further. We have to democratize democracy, Or, I mean, there's this old saying that the only answer to the crisis of democracy is more democracy, and this is somehow along this line, which I very much agree with, namely that we have to think about the state of affairs within the still existing liberal democracies. We have to think about how existing democratic institutions are somehow, they still exist, but they have become, let's say, less lively in a certain way, unlebendig. They are, at least in part, I mean, there's a certain void that people can have a certain sense for, I think. So with respect to these two pathologies, I agree, but at the same time, I think they are even deeper, or we need to think about how to react to those pathologies in maybe in a way that goes even further. Let's start with the first one, the representation gap. I mean, one possible reaction would be to say we need some kind of a quota. We need people. We need the parliaments to be more representative of, I mean, the majority of people. But the other question is, how does representation itself work? How does it? I mean, how can we do something against this widespread feeling of powerlessness that Michael Zürn, in his book, when he talks about the double alienation within modern democracies, I mean, part of this is this feeling of powerlessness and the feeling that even within those institutions and the moments where people should have a say and actually have a say, they don't. And even those who participate in, like the small man in the small cabin, the idea that this means that we are actually able to shape our collective destiny is somehow absent. So I think the representation gap opens up deeper questions about how, for example, parties work, how parties are able to get people engaged with respect to politics, and how, I mean, dimensions of direct participation can be included in what's going on here. The second gap, the decline in power, again, I think it's a very interesting and an important observation, but at the same time, the decline in power, or the question of what is it that is decided within in a democracy. I mean, this problem has existed much, I mean, for quite a while. The question, for example, of whether certain problems that affect a whole lot of people, the majority of people, let's say economic problems, whether they are excluded from democratic decision-making or not, is one of the major problems here. So the double exclusion, not only the exclusion of some of the voters. I mean, there's yet another question about who decides, meaning that a lot of, I mean, we just had elections in Germany, and I mean, there are so many people who are affected by the decisions that will be made by the new government, but at the same time are not part in voting for the government, meaning the immigrants. Or those of the immigrants who don't have citizen status. So this is one of the other problems with respect to the representation gap. But there's also the problem of powerlessness that leads to the question of what is it that is excluded from democratic decision making, and that is not only the NMIs. It's also about, as I said, I mean, a whole range of questions that touch upon the economics that in certain understandings are excluded as the realm of private decision-making from what we as a public and we as citizens can even decide upon. And this is something that comes up very often. And you mentioned, Michael Zürn mentioned, labor as one of the issues that has been. I mean, when we talk about regression, we should also talk about how the dynamics of this kind of falling back behind a certain state of affairs, how this worked. And it's obvious that the question of labor, that there has been a time where this and the question of labor is the question of the economy as such, of course, has been much more prominent, and where the idea that we have a say in this, or that there would be decisions with respect to I mean, some kind of the common good to be made within this realm have been much more prominent. So in order to look for the crisis of democracy, one has to look for the crisis of some of those institutions who used to be much more powerful and who used to represent, I mean, many more people than is the situation today. Last remark, the use of the word regression in Michael Zürn's analysis. I would think that we should be very careful to use this concept. It's an important concept, but it's something that comes with a lot of implications. It's not just a fall back behind a certain state of affairs. It is something that, I mean, I would define regression as an inadequate reaction to a crisis, some kind of unlearning that is the result of this inadequacy, or the result of the inability to react to a certain crisis. So if we talk about regression here, we need to look into the logics of this learning process and these processes of unlearning. The upshot is what we need to talk about: what are the crises that our democracies have not been able to address. Thus, I mean, with the result of a democratic regression.
Thank you very much. So if I understand you correctly, you see that we sort of are faced with a double exclusion. On the one hand, people are excluded from, certain groups of people are excluded from democratic decision-making processes. And on the other hand, some spheres of life are excluded from these democratic decision-making processes. If that is a fair description of what you just laid out, I would like to ask one question regarding this double exclusion, namely, which spheres of life do you think should be democratized that are currently not democratized, and how could we go about them? And you already touched upon sort of traditional institutions that used to play a big role in democracies. And I could imagine that you're pointing here to intermediary institutions like unions and parties. And if you could touch upon that a little bit too, because I'm sure Jan-Werner Müller would like to engage on that point too, on the role of intermediary actors.
So which, I mean, yes, double exclusion is a very fitting description. What spheres of life? I mean, I would say in order to democratize democracy, we have to democratize democracy. Democracy, in my understanding, is not just a form of government, it's a form of life. So in order to democratize democracy, we have to democratize forms of life all the way down, meaning that it starts at schools, it starts at, I mean, every kind of public institutions, all those public affairs, all those affairs that affect, those public affairs that affect the life of the individual should have some kind of democratic empowerment, some kind of democratic procedures, so that democracy can be learned and practiced in the micro institutions of our common life. So this is the first point, and of course this includes, this refers to intermediary institutions as those institutions who are so important for what you call democratic, I mean, kind of democratic education and the very possibility to see oneself as having a vote. So this is something that needs to be learned, that needs to be experienced, and if people don't experience this in their everyday life, they will not be that interested in democracy on a level, on let's say the higher and macro levels. What spheres of life, I mean, what comes to mind immediately in our situation here is the role of the market. I mean, those common goods like health, labor, education, and the debates, housing, the debates about what the role of the market should be in order to preserve democratic democracy and to preserve democratic citizenship. I think these are obvious examples in which it is necessary to open up public debate about the limits of the market with respect to our with respect to the common good, with respect to the common life, and also with respect to preservation of democracy.
Professor Müller, would you agree? Sorry.
I mean, talking about intermediary institutions and civil societies, there are quite some social movements and even institutionalized groups who have taken up those issues.
Professor Müller, would you agree that we need to translate the idea of democracy stronger to other spheres of lives? For example, the spheres that Jaeggi now pointed out, schools, education, but also labor and markets.
So let me say two things, if I may. So we've had double alienation, double exclusion, which are helpful concepts, but they mainly focus on, so to speak, the victims of regression or however else we want to describe recent trends. Let me throw in another, so to speak, double concept, namely double secession, by which I mean that on the one hand, many people, to put it bluntly, in the bottom thirds economically of our societies, as many people have, as many social scientists have pointed out, essentially are taking themselves out of democracy by no longer voting, by no longer engaging. And of course, the suggestion, plausible it seems to me, by many observers from Armin Schäfer to Piketty has been that, well, that's partly because there's nothing on offer for them. And as has also been pointed out many times, it's not true that all those at the quote-unquote bottom of society are just dying to vote for authoritarian right-wing populist parties, because if that's what they would love to do, hey, that's on offer. But certain socioeconomic programs don't seem to be on offer anymore, and that best explains maybe why they no longer participate. So that's part of that secession. But the other secession that we, in a sense, haven't talked about, and granted, this is more from a particularly American perspective, where some of these trends are maybe more pronounced, is that those at the very top have also taken themselves out of a common social contract. If the owners of concentrated wealth, as again the Pandora Papers have shown to us very clearly, end up paying something like 10% tax as opposed to everybody else who is in a different kind of world, that also amounts to a very serious distortion of democracy. And I think at this point, the fact that in this country, the United States, people no longer shy away from the term oligarchy has a certain justification. True, it's not the same as Russia, it's not the same as Lebanon. Nevertheless, the sense that there is a kind of fundamental break between those at the very top who, in a sense, live in a different world and experience a different kind of social contract than everybody else, I think is also important to take into account. Second remark, now finally to your question. So I agree entirely with Rahel, of course, that democracy is also a form of life, and that it's about daily interactions. It's about people being able to look each other in the eye, not to experience systematic hierarchies, humiliations, not forced to sort of engage in forms of deference, which we would associate much more with quasi-feudal relations. And clearly one of the things we have learned from theorists over the last 10, 20 years, probably most prominently someone like Elizabeth Anderson, is that there are many parts of our lives where, in effect, we experience feudalism or even outright dictatorship, and parts of the economy are the best example for that. So I agree with that. I agree with the diagnosis. I would simply add that democracy is, of course, also about organized power. And it's about being open to people coming together, engaging in collective action, partly on the basis of new ways of representing sometimes their interests, but also sometimes their identities, and sometimes new ideas. And this sort of gets to the importance of institutions which are sometimes sort of ridiculed as old hat, or, this is yesterday's democracy, such as political parties and also professional news organizations. So I think sometimes we neglect the importance of keeping these institutions open and dynamic, and to avoid the de facto cartelization of political systems or media systems, such that people really feel, look, I want to say something, I want to create a kind of following, I have something to say, I've discovered something about, let's say, in a press group, and I just cannot get into the system. Obviously, we can also think of instances where people outside those systems manage to organize social movements, engage in civil disobedience. I mean, all kinds of things we can think about. But at least I, at the risk of sounding overly status quo oriented, still think that ultimately it has to translate back into these kind of systems and institutions. And that's something that we often neglect when we talk about the status of our existing democracies. I think we still don't talk enough about how these various systems are financed, how open they are, how difficult it is to engage in, let's say, intra-party democratic debates, how difficult it is to found new parties, etc., etc. So that's where I would kind of put the emphasis in terms of where we might actually do quite a lot with institutions that we kind of already have.
Two things I would like to... Yes, sure, go ahead, please.
Just maybe there's too much agreement here on the, on the panel. I totally agree with Jan that both sides should be, are important, should be discussed. But just as a matter of fact, when we just observe how topics are put on the agenda, then it's interesting to see that once again, it is actually, it was Friday for Futures who put a topic on the agenda, or, give it a bit more urgency that should have been on the agenda for quite a while, that in some way has been on the agenda, but as we have experienced, the established politics have kind of, played it down, negated it, have reacted with some kind of apathy. So for me, it seems to be very important, the interaction between those two sides. The more dynamic, practice-oriented, social movements-oriented side of democratic politics, and the other one. And I totally agree that we shouldn't leave them out. And that, for example, the question, and this is different in Germany from the United States, the question how the parties organize deliberation, or whether and how parties are institutions in which deliberations can be organized and can be and decisions can be decision making can be institutionalized. That is a very important issue. Of course, I wouldn't argue against this part of democratic politics. I just want to point out how even this somehow lives from the dynamic and the liveliness of what is going on outside of those parties.
There are two aspects I would like to dive a little bit deeper in. The first one goes a little bit back to what you, Professor Müller, said at the beginning, this double succession. So my question then would be, because I agree with your analysis, is how do we break this downward spiral of social inequality and political inequality? So how can we make sure that there is something on the offer for those people in the lower third, and how can we make sure that those in the very top are not kind of playing by their own rules?
So again, at the risk of sounding very pedantic, I think it would be mistaken to think that there's a sort of obvious global solution, because it so much interacts with local conditions in terms of party systems, in terms of how existing what political scientists would call cleavages and conflicts are already set up. So alas, I cannot give you 3 bullet points that say, okay, take the manual, go to Hungary, go to Turkey, and boom, tomorrow it's gonna change. But at least in a number of countries, I think one fundamental lesson might be, and I think it's a lesson that has been backed up at least a little bit by what we experienced in Germany recently, is that if enough actors succeed in basically pushing aside what are often artificial culture wars that the right starts to instigate, partly to, I'm putting it very crudely, but not wrongly, I think, partly to distract from economic issues, then I think a lot is gained already. I mean, in the United States is a sort of much more blatant example of this. Here we have what some of our colleagues in social science, I think, have rightly called plutocratic populism. In other words, you have policies proposed by the Republican Party, which, when people sort of learn more about them, are not even popular among conservative voters. Even they say, wait a minute, we don't really want this. This is crazy. This is so obviously wrong and unjust. But if you manage to say, look, we're only going to talk about how our poor children are indoctrinated in schools by crazy teachers teaching critical race theory, then obviously these other issues tend to recede. So I think this is a starting point, but let me hasten to add that this does not mean what so many people in Europe are nowadays, I think, mistakenly concluding, which is that, oh, we must stop talking about identity politics. We must sort of tell these, vulnerable minorities that, sorry, guys, we have no time for you. We're only going to talk about economic issues. Plus, you're probably whining anyway, and maybe this isn't so important, etc. These are not mutually exclusive agendas. Plus, as has also been pointed out, any sort of simplistic division between the cultural and the economic doesn't really work anyway. In many instances, as soon as you look closer at how certain forms of domination and oppression actually work. But I think at least occasionally, it's a good idea not to take the bait or not to kind of accept the framing of certain conflicts that is very consciously put out by right-wing actors. When they essentially repeat the story about, okay, the conflict is really about supposed liberal cosmopolitans, anywheres versus the truly rooted people and so on. Alas, many liberals, even many people on the left, have sort of been repeating this framing as if it were objectively given, as if this was always the most important conflict. And it's not. And part of the art of politics, again, this goes to Michael Zürn's point that politics sort of has a certain primacy. Part of the art is precisely to define conflicts in the way you want to define them and not simply accept the framing that your opponent or adversary gives you, because that simply means that on one level, they control the debate. They control the framing. And far too often, I think certainly center-right parties in Europe have de facto ended up mainstreaming the far right simply because they accepted that framing. But as you know better probably than I do, in some European countries, even people on the left have been far too quick to say, oh, no, this is a problem, we talk too much about minorities, etc., as if you could sort of time travel back to some idealized, image of the 1950s, when supposedly it was purely about material interests, which even historically, of course, isn't true. I mean, to think that the labor movement was just the kind of interest group that talked about higher wages and better working conditions is just complete nonsense. So I know this didn't quite answer your question, but I hope it was vaguely interesting anyway.
No, I think it did to some extent answer my question too, and it leads me to another question that I would like to pose to you, Professor Jaeggi. If I understand Professor Müller correctly, he also just pointed out that the far right culturalizes certain issues and by that distracts us from the actual core of the issue that we should be looking at. Now, you, on the other hand, have in different occasions criticized the liberal model of democracy to sort of do maybe the opposite is probably not right, but go another path and sort of reducing politics to finding technical solutions. So while the far right culturalizes the sort of technocratic mode, the liberal mode of making politics sort of reduces it to a technical issue. Could you explain what you mean by this, and could you also maybe give an example for sort of also what Michael Zürn pointed to for taking out the politics and for making it about the right or wrong solution?
Yeah, I mean, first, I try to comment on Jan's remark and then get back to your question, include your question, because it somehow it does hang together, I think. I couldn't more than agree that we shouldn't accept this framework. We shouldn't accept the framework that plays out cultural identities as against the social question. This totally mistakes the fact that the so-called social question has changed. I mean, not only, and again, I couldn't agree more, not only was it always not just about material resources, it was always about recognition, about forms of life, about how to organize life and live our lives. So it has never been just about how much do I get from a certain kind of distribution. I mean, the social question, when it evolved, was about how to organize the production, and organizing the production means, I mean, talking about what do we need as a society, how and what do we want to produce. So I think that it has been wrong from the very first moment to give those issues out of hand and to let it, I mean, to buy into a discussion that would distinguish between cultural, political, and economical issues on this level. And this gets me back to the question of how to. I mean, I also think that just think about those. I mean, how those issues are played out against each other. It is so clear that to get rid of all gender toilets will not bring back a single working place in the so-called Rust Belt. So those issues do not have something to do with it. I mean, except if someone wants to distract us, as Jan rightly says. But on the other hand, people draw this connection. And where is this connection? I mean, where are the roots for this connection? The connection is, of course, there is a huge transformation of an economical transformation, a social transformation. There are transformations that people experience and that they that leaves them in what we have referred to as powerless situation. The problem is to vote against adoption rights for LGBTQs or to vote against all gender restrooms, which was a huge issue here. And even, I mean, after the elections, one of the politicians of the left party said, "Oh, maybe we should have talked less about gender and more about the social question," and so on. So this is the kind of playing things out against each other that is so destructive, I would say. The interesting point here is that those are transformations that have led to both, I would say. So if one takes the materialist point of view here, one would say, of course, I mean, a certain kind of economical transformation, the kind of cultural capitalism and immaterial capitalism that we experience, they have opened up possibilities and changes. They have not necessitated, but opened up changes in the realm of, let's say, gender relations. It is just something that happened. That, I mean, the roles of male and female have changed also according to what is going on in the sector of labor, for example. So those transformations have somehow led to, it's the same kind of transformation, the same kind of crisis that has led to different social transformations. And this is one of the reasons why people might think, okay, so let's say the liberalization with respect to cultural issues, or the cultural liberalization has something to do with the regression in those other spheres, or inability to deal with crisis in those other spheres. But this is just not the case. It's not that it's not because the left has somehow abandoned the working class that the situation is such. On the other side, as a matter of fact, we have not reacted to and faced the kind of crisis that comes out of this major social and economical transformation. This is, I think, a fact. And the question is how to react to those issues in a way that opens up emancipatory solutions, or solutions that address those changes in our way of life. And this will not be the old. It will not be the old social question. It will not be the old way of life that can be preserved, or that could be preserved, even if the left would go back to what then, I mean, falsely is called the social question. So the interesting question again is how to be able to thematize questions in a broad way and in an inclusive and broad way. And this back to the liberal, criticizing the liberal position and the kind of the idea that this is about technical solutions. My point here was always, it is always already about forms of life. It's not possible to separate out issues that are just about, or for example, I mean, a reaction that would solely thematize questions of distribution at this point will somehow not go far enough. It is about, and more, I mean, more and more when you face those transformations that will come about with the climate crisis. This is about discussing, debating, democratically deliberating about changing a whole form of life, which then is not just something that can be solved on a technical level, saying, okay, so we know we don't have to debate about our aims. We just have to figure out how the best technical solution to an aim that we already know and that is already prefigured is. So this was the point about the technical solution here.
And Professor Müller, I think it's fair to describe you as somebody who is a scholar of liberalism and also somebody who's sort of inscribed in this school of thought. But if you disagree, feel free to share that with us. Would you agree with this criticism that it's somehow sort of enshrined in liberal democracy, that it tends to give power to institutions that find technical solutions for certain problems but do not leave enough room for the social movements and for the more open forms of democracy that Rahel Jaeggi talked about earlier?
I completely understand that you want to generate some disagreement on the panel here, but I think it's unfortunately we are ultimately on the substantive issues just too much on the same page in all kinds of ways. And we might use somewhat different labels occasionally, and we could sort of try to polarize the debate and say, here's liberal versus radical democratic. But I'm not sure that's the most productive way forward. So I completely agree that one of the major pitfalls of politics today especially is a sort of technocratic temptation. And maybe I would simply add that maybe not so obviously, as a number of our colleagues I think have also started to point out, there can be a sort of really vicious circle between technocracy and populism. So technocrats basically say there's only one rational solution to something. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be irrational. The people's role is simply to nod and accept the solution. I mean, again, this goes a little bit in the direction of what Michael Zürn is also talking about. And that provokes very often, of course, a reaction among parties, not just populist parties, but especially populist parties, who then rightly say, where are the people in this? You know, what do you mean democracy without choices? But if then the Bolsonaros and Trumps of this world come to power and deny that, you know, COVID has any sort of causes any problems, then, of course, technocrats in turn are going to be emboldened again, saying, look, you give the people a choice and they vote for these, you know, for these clowns. And look, you know, even more power to us and less power to the people. And I think we saw a dynamic like this very clearly in the Euro crisis, where sort of these two tendencies were always reinforcing each other. And democracy understood as a set of choices, as a set of different representations about interests, ideas, identities, sort of competing openly, that is sort of then, that sort of disappears then between these two extremes. And I would agree that, I mean, I don't really sort of situate myself in a liberal tradition in any kind of German sense of the word. Anglo-American is a different story. But I would agree that, of course, yes, there has been a tendency to essentially empower more or less rational elites and say, well, you know, leave it to us to take care of certain problems. There is a sort of deep, if you like, demophobia in the sense of, you know, be careful with the people because they could always turn out to be irrational. A tendency that has been reinforced on the part of all those who today say, let's re-empower gatekeepers. You know, look at Brexit. Look at what happens if you give too much power to the people. And with that, I would again make the somewhat pedantic point that far too often we look at certain democratic institutions and also democratic innovations in isolation. So referendums are not the end of the world. And, you know, we can point to many good examples of where they actually do very positive work. We can also point at negative examples. The same, of course, is true of things like randomly chosen citizen assemblies. There are good things you can say for that, but to pretend that it's a panacea if you just sort of plug it in isolation into a system is clearly wrong. So it's simply a plea, again, very predictable, for a kind of holistic understanding of democracy, and basically then also resist the temptation to think that, oh, if we only, you know, empowered a couple of wise people to give us technocratic answers, we would be on the right path.
Thank you very much for that. And Jaeggi, would you like to jump in?
I mean, just again, I mean, I agree with Jan-Werner Müller that we agree on so many things. I would also say, I mean, one has to experiment with those, I mean, with new institutions, with kinds of, I mean, referendum isn't, I mean, not every referendum is of the same kind. One can think about how to organize referenda such that they are not, they don't have populist results. One can think about how the quota then must be, and so on and so on, and also the assembly. So this is something that one has to, I mean, experiment with, bring in new ideas with respect to this, and so on. So I think, again, it's not about radical democracy, whatever it takes, or liberal democracy, like having some experts who come up with the right formula for redistribution and organizing society. So it's just, I think you're right. There is so much to be figured out and to be invented here, but not so much that is where our position would just be on one or the other side.
And I think that's also completely fine, because I think conflict isn't always the most constructive way to get to insights. So I think it's very interesting to hear your sort of complementary perspectives on that. And I would now like to make a little cut and go to another subject that we already touched upon with the question of this feeling of powerlessness, Professor Jaeggi, that you described, that a lot of people have when they look at their personal future, but also the sort of collective future. It seems to me that this old slogan of progress, my children will be better off than myself one day, sort of has lost traction. A lot of people don't believe that. They are fearful of the future, and they're uncertain about the future. I would like to sort of differentiate these feelings about the future and how they relate to democracy. Professor Müller, you have written a lot about the question of fear on the one hand, but also about uncertainty. Could you elaborate on why you think that uncertainty is sort of an inherent part of democracy? And where does uncertainty become so all-consuming and so large that it turns into fear?
Yeah, very good. Which is to say, difficult question. I'm not claiming that uncertainty is any kind of value that we ought to think of as foundational for democracy. So it's not on the level of liberty or equality, which are the real sort of normative basics of democracy. All I was trying to say, to some degree, following the insight from our colleague Adam Przeworski in comparative politics, is that a democratic system must remain open, dynamic, and to some degree unpredictable. So that's a very limited point about uncertainty. It simply says that in a proper democratic system, the procedures are more or less certain, which is not to say that they can't be questioned or we can't criticize them or we can't change them. But for the most part, we kind of know how the next election is going to run. But the outcome, we're not going to quite know. In anything that's authoritarian, the outcome is known in advance. There's no uncertainty. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the procedures, which can always be changed at the last minute, which can be manipulated, and so on and so forth. So I'm not making the case for uncertainty as anything normative. I mean, especially after 18, 19 months of a pandemic, I think none of us would say, "Oh, uncertainty is great. You know, this is really something great in our lives." But it's also true, and I think I agree with those who sort of see a fundamental change. It's true that the fear of the future, in the sense of my children are going to be worse off, which in a sense actually isn't a matter of uncertainty. It's a certainty about it's going to be worse. It's actually not sort of up for grabs, really. People precisely, this goes back to one of our themes in this discussion, they actually kind of feel powerless. You know, if it was really uncertain, they might actually say, we can do something about this. But the secular change, which also Przeworski in his book about Crises of Democracy has pointed to, where he says, look, this is a real alarm bell. The fact that majorities now think or are pretty certain that their children are going to be worse off is really bad. And there are other studies which actually show or tend to show that this sort of pessimism does correlate with, alas, more authoritarian attitudes and less support for democracy. So in that sense, I wouldn't even describe it so much as fear, but a kind of certainty about, oh, it's gonna be worse, and that also means something is fundamentally wrong today. So why don't I throw my support behind more authoritarian actors, because maybe they can do something about it? And this, I think, has been a sort of, if you like, opportunity structure for more authoritarian politicians. They've also then usually tried to, I'm not telling you anything new here, they've tried to polarize societies as much as possible. They've tried to create a situation where it's us against them, and we are the only ones who can still do something for you and about the future. So I agree that this is a highly dangerous development, and at the risk of sounding slightly banal, again, it's part of the art of politics to map out futures in a way that can have an aesthetic dimension that sort of is something that, you know, ultimately is more about the imagination, obviously. And I would say it's not enough to then simply sort of in the abstract say, as sometimes even political theorists do when they say, oh, we just have to be more optimistic, or liberals have to be more optimistic, and so on. I mean, that's all PR. I mean, this is like European Commission style talk about, oh, we should, be more confident about the future and so on. No, you gotta do the hard work of actually imagining the future and give people something to work with.
Can I ask you both a personal question, if you don't mind? Do you personally share this view that the future is going to be worse, that we are seeing trends of regression? Professor Müller, do you want to go first, because you...
No, I obviously don't, otherwise I would have answered.
I mean, it's a personal question, you also don't have to respond to that, but I would be very interested if you personally also have this perspective on the future, this pessimistic view.
Well, if you push me, and it's fair enough to push people. In a recent book, I tried to make a distinction, and it's not a new distinction, between hope and optimism. So I don't think I'm particularly optimistic, but then optimism is here understood as a kind of estimation of probabilities, or again, as a certain kind of sense of certainty about, yeah, probably it's going to turn out well in the end. I would not say that I have that view, but hope is something different because it's much more about structural conditions for change and improvement. And if one no longer saw these paths of doing things differently, then I think it's much more justified to say, look, I mean, it's game over in a certain way. But I don't think we're in that situation. I think we can still figure out what we could do differently. And obviously that's incredibly difficult, and it's all very easy to sit here as a professor and kind of pontificate about this. But the possibilities are there. So in that sense, it's not structurally, you know, a hopeless situation. And that's, you know, I think what we should also communicate to other people, maybe, that look, it's not optimism, pessimism maybe isn't the best way of thinking about the challenge. It's much more about, you know, can something be done, or are certain avenues already closed off? And the latter, I think, is not the case.
So the optimist sort of thinks that the future will get better, and the hopeful person thinks that the future can get better. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, that's a good summary. Yeah.
Professor Jaeggi, I don't want to push you on it, but invite you to share your thoughts on your personal thoughts on this.
Again, I think it is obvious that things are gonna be worse if we don't do anything about them. Very much in the same line again. I don't especially like the, I mean, if you ask me, are you an optimist or a pessimist, I would always say neither. I mean, I'm neither a pessimist nor an optimist. How should I know? What I do know is that things are going to be worse if we don't take action. I mean, if we don't, and this is very much in line with the idea of hope. So the question is, can things be done otherwise? And at this point, I would say, yes, of course they can. So it's not, I mean, the idea that we have to sit here and, I mean, just look at those multiple crises that surround us without being able to do anything. This is clearly not the case. There are a lot of potentials. There are a lot of things that can be done. There are a lot of things that should be done immediately, I would say. I mean, there's a problem of the time horizon, of course. I mean, this is an intriguing question, but yeah, again, I mean, pessimism or optimism, whatever, but it's about clear, and it's not uncertain, but certain that things will get worse for our kids if we don't do anything about it. And not only with respect to the ecological crisis, also with respect to disintegration of society and inequality, and I mean all sorts of disintegrative moments that we might have to face. But again, it's not, I mean, this is man-made, and it can be changed by what human beings do and decide upon.
Yeah, that should give us hope that it's in our hands, at least to some extent. I would like to ask you the following. I mean, we've talked a lot about democratic regression now. I would like to ask the two of you if, and if so, where you see democratic progress. So what concrete actors or movements or processes with regards to the improvement of our democracies have you observed in the past, or do you currently observe, that give you hope that we will actually manage to democratically shape these transformations and that our children will be better off? Are there some sparks of hope that you see currently which we can maybe build upon, something concrete?
I mean, something concrete, I would say that Fridays for Future, Black Lives Matters in Germany, Deutsche Wohnenteignen, I mean, the campaigns that start to talk about the right to city with respect to property, and so have managed to bring the question of property and the question of how far should the market go back on the table. So those are movements that I think are very important. Also movements where refugees, I mean, who are not in the best situation to organize, but there are moments where, I mean, solidarity with refugees, but also refugees' ways to organize protests are somehow have been possible and will hopefully change the awareness for, I mean, this other crisis that our societies have to face. So yeah, I mean, there are, I would say a lot of it is about those movements who are able to bring those topics on the agenda. And then the next step would be how this can become politically effective, and how those movements, I mean, how the openness of the democratic system with respect to those issues, and how the awareness that a certain kind of that there are crises and transformations that you can't decide not to react to. I mean, there are so many things, like, I mean, starting from the necessity within the European Union to have something like a European labor movement that is powerful enough to shape politics, or something like, yeah, I mean, immigration right and so on. So there are so many issues that have just been, I mean, not completely neglected, but in some way there has been this tendency to just go on and just do, I mean, not, I mean, slow down things, just go on, or to pretend that we can ignore those issues and that we can just react with some like minor political decisions and so on. So, I mean, the hope would be that those openness for those issues and the awareness and the I mean, the learning process that should start from becoming aware of those issues and those crises, that this somehow is no longer blocked.
If we take these two examples of Fridays for Future and Black Lives Matter, I think what they have in common is that they demand radical transformation. And the response oftentimes from the institutions, from parties and parliaments, is sort of incremental change. Professor Müller, how do you think can these institutions become more responsive to these social movements? And feel free to touch upon these very concrete examples of Fridays for Future, maybe with a focus in Germany, and Black Lives Matter, maybe more with a focus in the US.
Well, so maybe also in response to your earlier question, so the two things that I think can make us somewhat hopeful. So yes, I would include what is often so casually dismissed as identity politics of one sort or another, which of course I hasten to add, echoing something that I think Rahel has written, quoting Thomas McCarthy, does not mean that, now victims are always going to have the last word, but they also have the first word in terms of pointing at forms of hierarchy and domination, which people weren't necessarily, to put it very mildly, paying attention to. Clearly, eventually, that has to lead to maybe new forms of regulation. So again, it's not true that, technical solutions are always wrong or regulation is always wrong. Of course, eventually things have to translate into laws, into regulation, and so on and so forth. That can take time, but that can also be, I'm saying the obvious, can be hastened by increasing a certain kind of social pressure. And there, if I, again, on the question of what makes you hopeful, if I can add one point, which I dare say goes a little bit against conventional wisdom today. Obviously, we have plenty of people around who nowadays say things like Facebook equals fascism, social media means the end of democracy, and so on and so forth. If you go back to the point we were discussing earlier about democracy, among other things, being a political system where ideally you would multiply representations as much as possible, empower as many people as possible to say, look, here's something we're not paying attention to, here's a form of oppression that we're not seeing, then the balance sheet, I think, gets more complicated. And I think a lot of the pathologies we're worried about have much more to do with monopoly power, with a particular kind of business model that is geared towards what some people now call incitement capitalism. Granted, I mean, there are also bad actors out there, including, with all due respect, among our fellow citizens who happen to be racist, misogynist, and so on. So yeah, they're also going to be empowered to make their voices heard. It's not like civil society is always the answer to everything. But if, as long as we have some, again, hope that, you know, democracy must be an open, dynamic system, and that means, okay, people have the right to come in and sort of make their voices heard, then I think it's far too early to conclude that this is a fatefully bad development. For me, it's still a striking example that within a couple of days, a hitherto unknown teenager from Florida, namely one of the survivors of the Parkland school massacre, could have more followers on Twitter than the almighty National Rifle Association. Now, did that change anything overnight? Are we better off here now in terms of gun laws? Not really. But is it totally trivial? Didn't it change anything in terms of how the conversation has gone? No. So, yes, I mean, I'm not making the case for incrementalism normatively. It's very difficult given unequal power structures, even in the best democracies we can think of. But again, I think there are sort of signs of hope that we sometimes are now too sort of tempted to dismiss, because it might give us a kind of perverse certainty to say, oh, of course, social media is horrible because it has let in the people.
Thank you very much. I would like to use the last minutes to also take in a question from the audience. And we have an international audience, but there are also people from Germany, of course, in the audience. And one of them has a very concrete question on the German democratic system. As political theorists, you might not be so comfortable with this question, but it is the following. If you could change 3 major things about the German democratic system, what would they be? Maybe with a short answer also, although that might be not very easy, I understand, of course. Professor Müller, do you want to go first and maybe name 1 or 2, and then Rahel Jaeggi, you can add if you like.
So I'll name 2, and they're not going to be very surprising, I think. One has to do with how we finance our political system. I mean, there's a tendency in Europe more generally to sort of turn up our noses at the crazy Americans, 14 billion spent on federal elections in 2020 alone. This is crazy. We're so much superior. But I don't think that's the case. I think in many ways, the campaign finance system in Germany, including with all its sort of shadow lobbying that can go on with, Philip Morris sponsoring summer festivals for major parties in Berlin and so on, has lots of vulnerabilities such that basically the system compounds already existing inequalities in a democracy. So that's one thing. And the second one would be that on issues, and that includes campaign finance, but also questions such as the size of the German parliament, where parties have to decide, so to speak, in eigener Sache, and where they have perverse incentives in many regards, there I think you have a prime example for introducing basically citizens' assemblies, as in randomly chosen citizens who can debate things which don't always require such enormous levels of expertise, such as nobody could possibly understand what's happening. And I think this would be something that would be seen by people as certainly legitimate. It would also be something where, if you really want to be daring, you might say, well, why would it be wrong to have a countrywide referendum, if that were legally possible, to decide on questions like this? Of course, again, it's a bit too facile to say, oh, look at Ireland. We can also think of counterexamples. But I think this is an area where what is sometimes now called lotocracy can play a very positive role, and I don't quite see the counter arguments to these sorts of proposals.
Professor Jaeggi, would you like to add? We are very close to the end of our session, so I'd like to ask you for a short answer, please.
Okay, I very much agree with the second. I mean, with including more more moments of direct democracy, but at the same time balancing them and making sure that they are like results of a process of deliberation. Maybe just one more thing, I would rebalance the federal system. I think there are a lot of blockages that are a result of the interaction between the federal system and government.
Thank you very much, Professor Jaeggi. Thank you very much, Professor Jan-Werner Müller. We now reached the end of our debate, and I want to thank the both of you for this fantastic opening of our conference, because we achieved exactly what we wanted to achieve, namely to raise the key questions we need to ask ourselves in the next 2 days when thinking about how we can democratize our democracies. Questions of representation, questions of reforming our institutions, but also a bit more radical questions of translating the organizing principle of democracy to other spheres of life, like labor and schools. So I'm looking forward to the next 2 days, and we will keep a lot of the ideas and thoughts that you shared with us here today with us. And now we will take a little break of 30 minutes, and then we'll be back with stories of democratization. So tune in half an hour, and thanks again to the two of you. Bye-bye.